"Get her out now. She doesn't belong in this room." The words cut through the emergency department of University Hospital of Richmond. Like a command everyone was expected to obey. The crowded ER fell into a strange silence as security officers approached the woman standing beside the trauma bay doors. Her navy blue scrubs were simple, her hospital badge hung quietly against her chest, and her calm expression seemed almost out of place in the chaos surrounding her. Dr. Naomi Carter, a 38-year-old black nurse, looked through the glass window at the patient, fighting for his life inside. The patient was not an ordinary man. He was Governor William Harrington, the leader of Virginia, rushed to the hospital after a serious medical emergency during a public appearance in Richmond. Nurses moved quickly between rooms. Doctors reviewed charts, and the sound of monitors filled the hallway. Naomi had noticed something others had missed. A small detail on the governor's medical report. A pattern she had seen before. "His condition is changing. You need to let me speak with the emergency team," Naomi said calmly. But standing across from her was the governor's family, surrounded by assistants, security personnel, and people who were used to being listened to immediately. Eleanor Harrington, the governor's wife, looked at Naomi's uniform before looking back at the doctors around her. "Are you the nurse assigned to this area?" she asked. Naomi nodded. "Yes, ma'am. But this is not about my position. This is about what he needs right now." Lucas Harrington, the governor's son, stepped forward. His expensive suit, polished shoes, and confident posture made him look like someone who had never been told no. "My father has a private medical team. We don't need staff members making decisions above their level." Naomi held his gaze. She had heard those words before. Not exactly the same words, but the same meaning. She had spent years watching people decide who she was before learning what she could do. "I'm not trying to take control," Naomi replied. "I'm trying to prevent a mistake." The hallway became still. A young nurse nearby lowered her eyes. Everyone could feel the tension between a woman in hospital scrubs and one of the most powerful families in Virginia. Then Eleanor pointed toward the security officers. "Please remove her from the area." Naomi did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked through the glass one more time at Governor Harrington. Her expression was not anger. It was concern. "You don't have to trust me," she said quietly. "But please don't ignore the warning signs." The security officers escorted her away from the emergency room entrance while the hospital staff watched in uncomfortable silence. Naomi walked slowly down the hallway, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. She had spent her entire career helping people who never knew her name. She had held the hands of frightened patients, comforted families during their hardest moments, and stayed long after her shift ended because someone needed her. She never expected recognition. She never searched for applause. But as the ER doors closed behind her, one thought remained in her mind. Someone inside that room needed the truth, even if nobody wanted to hear it. A few feet away, the emergency team continued working while the governor's condition grew more complicated. The people who had pushed Naomi away still believed they had removed a problem. They had no idea they had just removed the person who understood exactly what was happening. And within minutes, the entire hospital would learn the name they had overlooked. Long before anyone in that emergency room knew her story, Naomi Carter had already learned one important lesson. The people who needed the most help were often the ones nobody stopped to see. At 5:30 every morning, before the city of Richmond, Virginia, fully woke up, Naomi would walk through the quiet streets near her small apartment with a coffee in one hand and her worn hospital bag in the other. She never arrived late. She never walked past a patient without asking how they were feeling. To most people at University Hospital of Richmond, she was simply Nurse Carter, the woman who worked the toughest shifts and always stayed calm when everyone else felt overwhelmed. But there was a part of Naomi's life that almost nobody in the hospital knew about. Years earlier, before the blue scrubs and the hospital badge, she had worn a different uniform. She had served as a military doctor, working in medical units where every decision mattered and every second counted. She had treated soldiers, civilians, and families caught in impossible situations. After leaving the military, Naomi chose a quieter path. She wanted to care for people one at a time. She did not want titles, attention, or recognition. She only wanted to help. The person in front of you is always more important than your own pride, her grandmother used to tell her when she was young. Naomi carried those words everywhere, even on difficult days, even when people underestimated her. Years of experience had taught her that kindness did not require permission. That afternoon at University Hospital of Richmond, Naomi had been working a busy emergency shift when Governor William Harrington arrived. She had seen thousands of patients before, but something about his condition immediately caught her attention. Not because he was famous, not because he was powerful, because he was a person who needed help. She remembered the small details, the unusual changes, the signs that something was not right. That was why she stepped forward. That was why she spoke. But now she stood outside the emergency room, watching through the glass as others took over. The hallway around her felt colder than before. Nurses walked past quickly. Doctors moved from room to room. Nobody said anything. Naomi looked down at her hands for a moment. These were the same hands that had helped people survive some of their darkest moments. Hands that had spent years learning, studying, and serving. Yet in that moment, they were judged only by the uniform covering them. A young nurse named Emily Parker approached quietly. She was 26 years old and had been working at the hospital for less than a year. She looked nervous as she stood beside Naomi. "I am sorry," Emily whispered. Naomi turned toward her. "Sorry for what?" Emily looked toward the closed ER doors. "For what happened in there. They did not even listen to you." Naomi gave a small, tired smile. "Sometimes people hear your position before they hear your words." Emily lowered her eyes. "But you were right, were you not?" Naomi did not answer immediately. She looked back at the emergency room. Being right is not the important part. The important part is making sure someone gets the care they need. Inside the trauma room, the medical team continued working while Governor Harrington's condition became more difficult to manage. Outside, Naomi remained still. She could have walked away. She could have gone home and let someone else handle the situation. But that was never who she was. She stayed because leaving was easier than caring, and Naomi Carter had never chosen the easier path. Then, from inside the emergency department, a doctor suddenly stepped into the hallway holding the governor's medical chart. His face had changed. He looked confused, almost searching for an answer that was no longer in the room. His eyes moved toward Naomi. For the first time since she was removed, someone inside that hospital was beginning to understand that the woman standing quietly outside the door was not there by accident. The doctor holding the medical chart looked toward Naomi Carter with a hesitation that said more than words could. For several seconds, he simply stood there in the hallway, surrounded by the sounds of the emergency department, as if he was trying to understand how the person everyone ignored had noticed something nobody else had. His name was Dr. Samuel Whitmore, the senior emergency physician at University Hospital of Richmond. He had spent 20 years treating complex cases, and yet the expression on his face showed uncertainty. "Nurse Carter," he finally said, walking closer, "how did you know there was a problem?" Naomi looked at the chart in his hands. She could see the worry in his eyes. "Because I have seen this pattern before," she answered quietly. The symptoms were not matching the original assumption. Dr. Whitmore glanced back toward the treatment room. The atmosphere inside had changed. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. Now there were questions. Now there was doubt. But outside the doors, Naomi remained calm. She did not celebrate being noticed. She did not say she had warned them. She only asked one question. "Is he getting the care he needs?" Dr. Whitmore paused. That question surprised him. Most people in her position would have been angry. They would have demanded an apology. They would have reminded everyone that they were right. But Naomi was not thinking about herself. She was thinking about the patient. "We are reviewing everything," he said. "But I need to understand your background. You saw something our team missed." Naomi looked down at her hospital badge. For a moment, she considered saying nothing. She had spent years keeping her past private. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because she never wanted people to treat her differently because of a title. "I worked in military medicine," she finally said. Dr. Whitmore raised his eyebrows. "Military medicine?" "Yes. What role?" Naomi was quiet for a moment. "I was a physician before I became a nurse." The hallway seemed to become even quieter. Emily Parker, the young nurse standing nearby, looked surprised. "You were a doctor?" she asked softly. Naomi nodded. "A long time ago." Dr. Whitmore studied her carefully. Why did you leave that career? Naomi looked through the glass doors toward the patient room. Because sometimes people need someone who listens more than someone who simply gives orders. Her answer stayed with him. Inside the hospital, people were beginning to ask questions about the woman they had removed. Not because of her position, not because of her appearance, because they were starting to understand the depth behind the person they had dismissed. Meanwhile, in a private waiting area, the Harrington family remained unaware of what was happening outside. Eleanor Harrington sat with her hands folded, surrounded by assistants who spoke quietly into phones. Lucas paced near the window overlooking Richmond. "Everything will be handled," he said confidently. "The hospital knows who my father is." Eleanor looked toward the closed doors. "I just do not understand why that nurse was so determined." Lucas shook his head. Some people forget their place when they get too comfortable. The words traveled through the room, but nobody answered. A hospital administrator named Rebecca Mills entered carrying a folder. She had worked at University Hospital of Richmond for 15 years, and she rarely looked uncertain. Today was different. "Mrs. Harrington," she said carefully, "there is something you need to know about Nurse Carter." Eleanor looked up. "What about her?" Rebecca opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents that revealed a story almost nobody in the hospital knew. "Naomi Carter is not just a nurse," Rebecca said. "Her history here goes much deeper than that." Across the building, Naomi stood beneath the bright hospital lights, unaware that her hidden past was about to come forward. The people who had judged her by her uniform were about to discover the person behind it. Rebecca Mills placed the folder on the table in front of Eleanor Harrington, and for the first time that afternoon, the confidence inside the private waiting room began to disappear. The room that had been filled with quiet conversations and important phone calls suddenly felt smaller. Eleanor looked at the folder, then back at the administrator. "What exactly are you saying?" she asked. Rebecca took a slow breath. "I am saying that Naomi Carter is one of the most experienced medical professionals in this hospital. Her current position does not tell the whole story." Lucas Harrington crossed his arms. "She is a nurse. That is what everyone saw." Rebecca looked directly at him. "That is exactly the problem. Everyone saw a title. Nobody looked deeper. The words stayed in the room." Outside, the emergency department continued moving around Naomi. Doctors checked information. Nurses reviewed notes. The patient they were trying to save was still surrounded by uncertainty. Naomi stood nearby, quietly waiting, but her mind was not focused on the people who had judged her. It was focused on the person behind the glass. Years earlier, Naomi had learned that medicine was not about recognition. It was about responsibility. When she served as a military physician, she had walked into situations where people were afraid and overwhelmed. She had learned to listen before acting. She had learned that the smallest detail could change everything. Those lessons followed her into every hospital room. Dr. Samuel Whitmore stepped closer to Naomi again. His expression had changed from confusion to respect. "I reviewed the notes you mentioned," he said. "You were right about the pattern." Naomi nodded slowly. "I was only doing what any medical professional should do." Dr. Whitmore looked at her carefully. Most people would have been angry after what happened. Naomi looked toward the emergency room doors. Anger does not help a patient breathe easier. It does not solve a medical problem. Her answer left him silent. Inside the waiting area, Rebecca opened the folder and showed Eleanor several documents. After leaving military service, Naomi chose to continue serving people here in Richmond. She could have worked anywhere. She had offers from major medical centers across the country. Instead, she stayed close to the community. Eleanor looked through the pages. The more she read, the quieter she became. Lucas leaned forward. "Why would someone with that background work as a nurse?" Rebecca answered softly. "Because she wanted to care for people directly. She did not want people seeing a title before seeing a human being." At that moment, a young doctor entered the waiting room. His face was serious, but his voice remained calm. "Mrs. Harrington, there is someone you need to speak with." Eleanor stood immediately. "Is my husband okay?" The doctor paused. "The team is working hard. But there is something important you should know." He looked toward the hallway where Naomi was standing. "The person you removed from the emergency area may be the person who can help us the most." Lucas looked confused. You mean the nurse? The doctor nodded. Yes, Nurse Carter. The hallway seemed to freeze. A few hospital workers nearby stopped what they were doing. The same woman who had been told she did not belong was now the person everyone was turning toward. Naomi noticed the attention but did not move. She simply waited. Eleanor slowly walked toward the hallway. For the first time, she looked at Naomi not as an employee, not as someone wearing a uniform, but as a person with a story she never bothered to learn. Miss Carter, Eleanor said quietly. Naomi turned. Yes, ma'am? Eleanor struggled to find the right words. Before she could speak, another message came from inside the emergency room. The medical team needed help. The moment had arrived. Naomi had a choice. She could remember the disrespect, the assumptions, and the way she had been pushed aside. Or she could do what she had always done. She could step forward when someone needed her. The hallway outside the emergency room became completely still as Naomi Carter stepped toward the doors she had been forced away from only minutes earlier. The same people who had watched her leave now watched her return. But Naomi did not walk back with anger in her eyes. She walked back with focus. Dr. Samuel Whitmore opened the door for her. We need your assessment, he said quietly. Naomi looked at him for a moment. Are you asking because you trust me now, or because there is no other option? The doctor lowered his head slightly. Because I should have listened the first time. Those words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened. Naomi entered the emergency room, and the atmosphere changed. The staff moved aside as she approached the medical team. She did not demand attention. She did not remind anyone that she had been right. She simply reviewed the information, listened to the doctors, and looked at the details that others had overlooked. Tell me everything that happened since he arrived, Naomi said. The team quickly explained the situation. She studied the notes, the readings, and the timeline. Her expression remained calm, but her mind was working quickly. The problem is not what you are treating, she said. The problem is what you have not considered. The room became quiet. Dr. Whitmore stepped closer. What do you see? Naomi pointed to the information in front of them. A hidden complication. His condition changed before the symptoms became obvious. We need to adjust our approach now. The doctors exchanged looks. This was not a nurse giving an opinion. This was an experienced medical professional recognizing a pattern. Across the hallway, Eleanor Harrington watched through the glass window. She saw the same woman she had ordered removed now, guiding the team with confidence and patience. For the first time, she noticed something beyond the uniform. She noticed the years of knowledge behind Naomi's calm voice. She noticed the way everyone in the room listened. Lucas stood beside his mother, unusually quiet. The certainty he had carried earlier was gone. I did not know, he whispered. Eleanor looked at him. Neither did I. Inside the emergency room, Naomi continued working with the team. Every instruction she gave was clear. Every question she asked had a purpose. She treated everyone around her with respect, even those who had not shown her the same. A younger nurse watched her carefully. How are you staying so calm? She asked during a brief moment. Naomi looked at the patient through the glass. Because someone else is depending on us. This is not about what happened to me. The young nurse nodded, understanding something important. Naomi was not powerful because of a title. She was powerful because she never allowed someone else's judgment to change who she was. Meanwhile, Rebecca Mills returned to the waiting area, carrying another document. She placed it gently on the table, in front of Eleanor and Lucas. There is more you should know, she said. Eleanor looked at the document. More? Rebecca nodded. 8 years ago, Governor Harrington's daughter was treated for a serious illness. She survived because a donor stepped forward. Lucas looked confused. What does that have to do with Naomi? Rebecca paused. Everything. The room fell silent. Eleanor slowly looked toward the emergency room doors where Naomi was still helping save her husband. Are you saying? Rebecca nodded. Naomi Carter was the person who donated what your daughter needed. The words settled over the room like a quiet storm. The woman they had dismissed. The woman they believed did not belong. The woman they had removed without knowing her story. She had already saved their family once, and now she was standing in the hospital again, choosing to save them one more time. The truth had finally arrived. But Naomi was not waiting for an apology. She was still doing the only thing she had ever cared about, helping someone who needed her. For the first time since Governor William Harrington arrived at University Hospital of Richmond, the emergency room became quiet. Not because the danger had disappeared, but because everyone inside finally understood the importance of listening. The bright hospital lights reflected across the polished floor as Naomi Carter stood beside the medical team, calmly reviewing every detail. Outside the glass doors, Eleanor Harrington remained frozen in place. The information she had just learned felt impossible to process. The woman she had ordered removed from the room was the same person who had helped save her daughter years earlier, the same person she had judged without knowing. Rebecca Mills watched Eleanor carefully. "Sometimes the people who change our lives are the people we never take the time to understand," she said softly. Eleanor did not respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on Naomi. She watched the way Naomi spoke to the doctors. She watched the way the staff respected her. She watched how Naomi never once looked back at the people who had doubted her. Inside the emergency room, Naomi continued guiding the team. "Let us review everything one more time," she said. Her voice was steady. "The patient is not just a case on a chart. He is a person with a family waiting outside." Dr. Whitmore nodded. He had spent decades building a reputation as a skilled physician, but at that moment, he was learning something from Naomi that had nothing to do with medical knowledge. "You really meant it when you said this was not about being right," he said. Naomi looked at him. "Being right is easy when someone else pays the price. Doing what is right means putting the patient first." The words stayed with him. Around the room, nurses and doctors moved with a new sense of purpose. Naomi did not lead because she demanded authority. She led because people trusted her judgment. In the waiting area, Lucas Harrington sat down for the first time all afternoon. The confidence he had carried earlier was replaced by silence. He looked at the floor. "I thought I knew who she was," he said quietly. Eleanor looked at him. "No. You thought you knew what she was." Lucas had no answer. The difference between those two things suddenly felt much larger than he expected. A hospital administrator walked by carrying a stack of paperwork and stopped when she saw Naomi through the glass. She smiled slightly. "That woman has spent years helping people in this building," she said. "Most patients never knew her full story. They only knew that she stayed when others left." Eleanor listened carefully. Her expression changed. The image she had created of Naomi was slowly disappearing, replaced by the reality of a person she had never bothered to see. A woman who had served her country. A woman who had chosen compassion over recognition. A woman who had saved her family without ever expecting anything in return. Inside the emergency room, Naomi finally stepped back from the team. The immediate crisis had passed, but she remained nearby. She looked through the window at the city outside. Richmond continued moving as it always did. Cars traveled down the streets. People walked along the sidewalks. The world outside had no idea what had happened inside this hospital. Naomi placed her hands together quietly. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the day. Not the anger, not the disappointment, just the exhaustion of being misunderstood and the peace of knowing she had still chosen kindness. Emily Parker approached her. "You could have walked away," she said. Naomi looked at the young nurse and smiled gently. "Yes, I could have. Why did you stay?" Emily asked. Naomi looked back toward the patient room. "Because someone needed me." The answer was simple. No speech, no demand for recognition, just a reminder of who she had always been. Outside the room, Governor Harrington's family stood in silence, beginning to understand that the person they tried to remove from the emergency room had never needed their approval. She had carried her own strength long before they knew her name. The hospital hallway remained quiet, as the truth slowly reached everyone who had been standing on the outside looking in. For years, Governor William Harrington had been known as a powerful leader in Virginia. People recognized his name before they met him. They opened doors for him. They listened when he spoke. But inside University Hospital of Richmond, he was no longer a governor. He was simply a father, a husband, and a patient whose life had depended on someone he failed to recognize. Eleanor Harrington stood near the emergency room doors, watching Naomi Carter through the glass. Her thoughts returned to 8 years earlier. She remembered the fear of that difficult time, the endless hospital visits, and the uncertainty surrounding her young daughter. She remembered doctors explaining that a donor had stepped forward and given their family a chance when they needed it most. But she never knew the person behind that gift. The donor had chosen privacy. Naomi had never told anyone. Why did she never say anything? Eleanor whispered. Rebecca Mills looked at her. Because she did not do it for attention. The answer was simple, but it carried a weight Eleanor could not ignore. Inside the emergency room, Dr. Samuel Whitmore reviewed Naomi's notes again. He looked at her with a mixture of admiration and regret. "You had every reason to leave," he said. Naomi looked up from the chart. "Maybe. After everything that happened, most people would have walked away." Naomi gave a small smile. Maybe they would have. But the patient did not choose what happened outside this room. Dr. Whitmore nodded slowly. He finally understood that Naomi's strength was not only in her medical knowledge, it was in her ability to separate personal pain from someone else's need. That was something difficult to teach and impossible to fake. A few minutes later, Governor Harrington became stable enough for his family to receive an update. The doctors explained that the team had made the right adjustments at the right time. Eleanor listened carefully. Every word reminded her of the moment she had dismissed Naomi without knowing who she was. Lucas stood beside her, silent. The young man who once believed status determined importance now struggled with a different reality. He looked toward the emergency room. "I judged her before I knew anything about her," he said. Eleanor did not correct him because she knew he was right. The hospital staff slowly returned to their duties, but the story moving through the building was not about the governor's position. It was about Naomi, the nurse who stayed calm when others panicked, the woman who carried years of experience without needing to announce it, the person who helped even when she was not respected. Near the end of her shift, Naomi stepped into a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria. The noise of the emergency department faded behind her. She sat with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Emily Parker joined her. "Does it bother you?" Emily asked. Naomi looked up. "What?" "That they only see you now because they found out who you are." Naomi looked down at the coffee in her hands. The question stayed with her for a moment. "People often believe a story after they know the ending," she said. "But the person living the story still has to keep going before anyone understands." Emily nodded. She knew those words were not just about today. They were about years of being overlooked and underestimated. Outside the cafeteria window, the afternoon sunlight stretched across Richmond. The same city that had watched Naomi walk through hospital doors every day was now beginning to see her differently. But Naomi was not searching for approval. She had never needed a room full of people to tell her what she already knew. Her worth was never created by recognition. It existed long before anyone noticed. Then, as she prepared to return to work, a hospital employee approached her with a message. Governor Harrington was awake, and he wanted to speak with her. Naomi paused for a moment. She knew this conversation would not be easy, but she also knew something else. The same compassion that brought her back into the emergency room would guide her through whatever came next. The room was quiet when Naomi Carter entered. It was not the silence of fear or uncertainty. It was the silence of a moment when people finally understood the weight of what had happened. Governor William Harrington rested in the private recovery room at University Hospital of Richmond, Virginia. The machines around him were calm now, the urgency of the emergency replaced by a peaceful rhythm. But the most important conversation of the day had not happened between doctors and medical charts. It was about two people standing on opposite sides of a misunderstanding. Naomi stood near the doorway, unsure what to expect. She had spent years helping people through difficult moments, but she had never needed anything from them afterward. She did not come looking for gratitude. She did not come looking for an apology. She came because someone asked to speak with her. Governor Harrington looked toward her as she entered. His face showed exhaustion, but his eyes showed something else. Reflection. "Miss Carter," he said quietly. Naomi stepped closer. "Governor Harrington." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The powerful man who was used to leading conversations struggled to find the right words. Finally, he looked down. "I owe you an apology." Naomi remained silent, allowing him to continue. "Earlier today, my family and I made a decision about you, without knowing anything about you." He paused. "We saw your uniform before we saw your humanity." The words were difficult for him to say. but he did not avoid them. Naomi looked at the window beside him. Outside, Richmond moved beneath the evening sky. Cars passed along the streets. People continued their lives, unaware of the quiet moment happening inside the hospital. "Governor, what happened today was not about me," Naomi said. "It was about making sure you received the care you needed." He nodded slowly. "That is exactly what makes this harder." He looked back at her. "You helped my family years ago. You helped me today. And both times you asked for nothing." Naomi smiled gently. Someone needed help. That was enough. The governor lowered his head. The sentence stayed with him. In his life, he had seen many people help because cameras were present or because recognition followed. Naomi was different. She helped when nobody was watching. She helped when the reward was invisible. Outside the room, Eleanor Harrington waited quietly. When Naomi stepped into the hallway, Eleanor approached. The confidence she had carried earlier was gone. In its place was humility. "Miss Carter," she said softly. Naomi stopped. Eleanor took a breath. "I was wrong about you." Naomi listened. "I looked at your position and decided I understood your value. I did not take the time to know your story." Her voice became quieter. "I am sorry." Naomi saw the sincerity in her expression. She knew apologies did not erase moments of judgment, but she also knew people could change when they were willing to face the truth. "Thank you for saying that," Naomi replied. "The important thing is what we choose to do after we realize we were wrong." Eleanor nodded, holding back emotion. Lucas Harrington stood nearby, watching the exchange. The lesson was not lost on him. He had spent his life around influence and reputation, but he had never seen strength expressed this way. Not through control, not through status, through grace. Later that evening, the hospital administration gathered briefly to recognize Naomi's actions. She stood among her colleagues, uncomfortable with the attention. When Dr. Whitmore spoke, he did not focus on her past titles or achievements. He spoke about her character. "Today reminded all of us that experience does not always announce itself," he said. "Sometimes it walks quietly through the door wearing a simple uniform." Naomi looked around the room at the nurses, doctors, and staff members who had worked beside her for years. She did not need a ceremony to know who she was. But for the first time, the people around her understood it too. The woman they once overlooked had never been invisible. They had simply failed to see her. The morning sun rose over Richmond, Virginia, casting a warm, golden light across University Hospital of Richmond. The emergency department was busy again, just like any other day. Phones rang, nurses moved between rooms, doctors reviewed patient notes, and families waited with hope in their eyes. Life continued. But something inside the hospital had changed. People walked the same hallways, but they no longer saw each other the same way. Near the nurses' station, Naomi Carter adjusted her badge and prepared for another shift. The same badge that once represented only a job now carried a different meaning for the people around her, not because of a title, not because of a story that had finally been revealed, because they had witnessed the person behind it. Emily Parker approached with a smile. "You know everyone is talking about you, right?" Naomi looked up and smiled softly. "I hope they are talking about the patients." Emily laughed quietly. "That sounds exactly like you." Naomi returned to her work, checking on patients and speaking with families. She did not walk differently. She did not act like someone who had finally received recognition. She remained the same person she had always been. The person who listened, the person who cared, the person who stayed. Across town, Governor William Harrington sat in his office at the Virginia State Capitol in Richmond, thinking about the events that had changed his perspective forever. The governor's office was filled with reminders of success. Awards, photographs, and moments from a long political career covered the walls. But one memory stood above all others now: a quiet woman in hospital scrubs who never asked to be seen. His assistant entered with a document. "Governor, the hospital has released the final report." William nodded. He looked at the paper but did not immediately open it. "Add something to the schedule," he said. "I want to visit the hospital again." His assistant looked surprised. "For an official appearance?" William shook his head. "No, Not this time. He looked out the window, for a personal reason. A few days later, William returned to University Hospital of Richmond without a large group of staff members or cameras. He walked through the same hallways where Naomi had once been dismissed. But this time, he was not arriving as someone expecting special treatment. He was arriving as someone ready to show respect. He found Naomi near the emergency department entrance. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. "You are working again," he said. Naomi smiled. "Patients still need care." William nodded. "That is what I keep thinking about. You were treated unfairly, and your response was still compassion." Naomi looked at him quietly. "People make mistakes. What matters is whether they learn from them." The governor took a breath. "I spent many years believing leadership meant having the loudest voice in the room." He paused. "You showed me that real leadership sometimes belongs to the person who quietly chooses to do the right thing." Naomi did not respond immediately. She simply nodded. There was no need for a long speech. Some moments were better understood in silence. Later that week, the hospital created a new training program focused on respect, communication, and recognizing the value of every member of a medical team. Naomi agreed to help, but only under one condition. "Make sure the lesson is not about me," she told the hospital leadership. "Make it about everyone who feels invisible while doing important work." That message stayed with the staff. Years later, many people would remember the day a governor entered an emergency room and discovered the person who could save him was someone he almost ignored. But Naomi remembered something different. She remembered the patient who needed help. She remembered the responsibility she carried. She remembered that kindness had never been a weakness. It had always been her strength. As evening arrived over Richmond, Naomi walked through the hospital corridor one more time. The lights reflected softly against the floor. The sounds of the hospital surrounded her. Footsteps, conversations, hope. She stopped for a moment near the window and looked outside at the city below. The world had changed a little. Not because someone powerful had apologized. Not because someone important had finally noticed her. It had changed because one person chose compassion when it would have been easier to walk away. And in that quiet moment, the hospital understood the truth Naomi had carried all along. A person's value is never determined by the uniform they wear. It is revealed by the lives they choose to touch.